Well, here we are into our 6th week of class at Business Law. We have 2 exams that we've done. Hopefully you guys are doing well and are enjoying the class. And in this next group of chapters that we look at, the next 9 chapters specifically, if I'm counting them correctly, we're going to be dealing solely with contracts. It's the biggest segment in business law as far as what we cover, and we cover it very much in depth. But for the purpose of today's chapter, chapter 11, it is giving us an overview of contracts. If any of you have ever been snorkeling, you know that you can skim along the surface of the water and breathe and look at everything below you that's way down there, or you can take a deep breath and then dive down and go deep and see everything a lot closer. Well, for the purpose of today's video and chapter 11, we're skimming along the surface of the water as we snorkel and going to take a broad look at everything that's below us. And in the following chapters, we're going to dive down and look at the various things and aspects of contracts much more, just a whole lot closer than we are in this particular chapter. So this is the broad overview of contracts. Let's get started with this segment here. There we go. As far as contracts law goes, the sources of contract law, as we discussed in class, 2 primary sources. Statutory law, where the courts have to look at statutes, laws that were made by the legislatures for contracts, as well as previous cases, common law, that developed contract law over the years. And we will be looking at cases that go way, way back into Old England that speak to principles of contract law, and they're still referred to today, they're still cited today. The whole purpose of or function of contract law is to promote stability and predictability. You want to be able to know that when you enter into an agreement with someone, if it's a valid agreement, that it can be enforced, and that if they do breach it, you do have a remedy available to you, and that the courts do provide that remedy. It's stability and predictability for you. The definition of a contract that's given in the second restatement of contracts is a promise or a set of promises for the breach of which the law provides a remedy, or the performance of which the law gives in some way recognizes as a duty. And if you see that, you'll see how, take a close look at that, you'll see that that has all the aspects in one a broad definition of what a contract is. And when we look at a contract and try to figure out what's going on in that contract, we don't take into consideration what the parties were thinking or feeling, because we can't read minds and we can't go down that road. That's all very, very subjective. The courts don't do that. And this is very important. Very, very important. When it comes to interpreting contracts, the courts base it on what's known as the objective theory. The objective theory, not subjective, but objective. What the parties said, what the parties did, what the parties wrote down. And it's got nothing to do with the person saying, well, when I entered into the agreement, this is what I really thought. The courts won't even go there. It's all based upon the objective theory of contracts and how they interpret contracts. Now, contracts have 4 essential elements, and we're going to be hammering these 4 elements in every single session so that you guys have it committed to memory. But the 4 elements are, there has to be, number 1, an agreement. Offer and acceptance between the parties. Number 2, there has to be consideration, which we call bargained for exchange between the parties. There has to be capacity. The parties have to be competent in order to enter into the agreement. We can't have somebody who's drunk or disabled or under the age of 18. They're considered to not have sufficient capacity to enter into an agreement. And the agreement has to be legal. It can't be something that's against the law or against public policy. So you have agreement, consideration, capacity, and legality. Those 4 essential elements. If you get nothing else from business law, these are the 4 things you need to remember. There's various types of contracts, bilateral versus unilateral. We're going to go deeper into that. Bilateral is a promise for a promise. Unilateral is a promise for an act, and we'll talk about that in class. Formal versus informal, on paper versus just spoken. And express versus implied. And I give an example of that with the person who's having his taxes done. Pretty timely, since our taxes were due a little bit later this year in July. But express versus implied, and we'll cover that, and we have covered that in class. Express, this is what we're talking about, or implied by our behavior between the parties. Also, when we're dealing with types of contract, these are two important terms to know: an executed contract versus an executory contract. An executed contract is one that's been performed. An executory contract is one that's in the process of being performed. So you need to be able to know and distinguish those two terms. And when it comes to seeing whether or not a contract, what status it is, there are 4 different classifications. It's valid if all 4 elements are there: agreement, consideration, capacity, legality, functioning on all 4 cylinders. We have probably a valid contract. If one of them falls short, we may have a voidable contract or unenforceable contract. And if it's an illegal contract, contract, it's void, not even a contract at all. Let's see, next one, quasi-contract. Quasi-contract is not an actual contract, but the courts, in order to be equitable, behave as if, quote, as if, unquote, a contract exists. And that's an important distinction to make. There's limitations in recovery with regard to a contract in quasi-contract, and there's no recovery if an actual contract exists. So in quasi-contract, there is no contract. And again, all these points, we're going to go deeper into the subsequent chapters and cover them in greater intensity and greater depth. But quasi-contract means there is no contract. The courts behave as if a contract exists. I believe the last slide deals with different types of interpretations of contracts, and that's at the very end of the chapter. You need to have a general understanding of all those terms to help you with the test. But for example, the plain meaning rule. The courts in general look to what the plain meaning of the contract is. They don't try to insert anything fancy. If you see hoof prints, you don't look for zebras, you look for horses, as the old saying goes. And there are 8 great rules of interpretation that are used by the court. Again, have a general understanding of those different rules of interpretation, and you should do okay. We're coming up on 8 minutes here, so I'll wrap it up. Nothing else with this regard to the chapter, but we'll be looking at the next 3 chapters, looking at agreement, consideration, and capacity and legality. So I hope you enjoy those videos. And for now, let me just say, Bollinger out.